My name is Emily, and I was a Master of Science student in Jason Gibbs' lab at the University of Manitoba. So today I'm going to be presenting a little bit about my thesis project. And yeah, so let's get into it. I would like to thank, before I start off, all of the fantastic people that helped me out along the way. I really couldn't have done it without the immense amount of help that I got. So thank you to all these people, and also thank you to my funders. Okay, so several independent studies have shown that bees are declining in abundance and diversity globally. This is clearly a problem, since at least 70% of flowering plants in temperate regions depend to some degree on animal pollination for their sexual reproduction, and bees are generally considered the largest contributor to this. Fruit and seed-setted crops are also known to suffer as bee declines, which is, of course, bad for humans. Human activity has been linked as the primary driver of these declines, especially activities like large-scale farming. So currently, because of things like farming and urbanization, over half of all ice-free land in North America is in an intensely disturbed state, with grasslands being the hardest hit. Bees are also not isolated. Of course, they are actively involved with their host plants, and so losses in abundance and diversity of bees can influence the network of interactions within the community. Network size and structure, for example, are known to change along landscape disturbance gradients. But more importantly, disturbance can reduce network stability, making them more susceptible to collapse. Besides widespread habitat loss, disturbance from things like farming alters the amount of edge habitats within the landscape, where an edge habitat is defined as a place where two dissimilar cover types meet. For example, where a forest patch would meet something like a cereal field, or even where a cereal field meets another different kind of cereal field. Edge density is one way to measure the amount of edge habitat in the landscape, and it's basically just the ratio of these total edge lengths to the total landscape area. So greater edge density would therefore equal greater total edge habitat length. Disturbance also changes land cover diversity, or CAN, which is the number and types of patches within the landscape. So the most widely used metric for this is the Shannon's Landscape Diversity Index, or SHDI for short, which is calculated in the exact same way as for something like community diversity. So whereas habitat loss generally has large-scale negative effects on bees, habitat loss that increases the number of edge habitats and patch diversity can possibly have different effects on communities and could maybe actually be beneficial for bees. So land cover diversity, or a greater amount of it, would be good because it provides a diversity of patch types for bees to forage at, while edge habitats tend to have the highest amount of things like plant abundance and diversity in the landscape. Edges can also help to connect simplified landscapes so that bees have less far to travel whilst foraging. So I performed 2 studies for my thesis a few years ago, examining how gradients of cropping, land cover diversity, and edge density influence bee communities and plant bee networks, which I ran using generalized linear mixed modeling. So essentially, I measured bee communities for their abundance, richness, and community functional dispersion. So this last one, functional dispersion, is a measurement of functional trait distribution within multidimensional space, where functional traits are things like nesting location, diet breadth, sociality, and I also used average species body size. So it's basically just a fancy way of looking at functional diversity. For networks, I measured stability, which is the ability of a network to resist secondary extinctions of bees following plant extinctions. So the line in this graph here is kind of a best case scenario of an extinction slope for a bee community after plants have been lost, because it takes longer for bee species to start being lost with more plant extinctions, which is a good thing. So because cropping removes nesting and foraging resources, I predicted that both bee communities and networks would be negatively impacted by high levels of cropping, while on the other hand, I predicted that higher land cover diversity and edge density would have the opposite effect, since they potentially add nesting and foraging resources back to the landscape. And the whole point of these studies were to inform policies aimed at conserving wild bee populations and network functionality within Manitoba. So I performed my studies in the southern region of Manitoba, Canada, this area has been heavily disturbed by cropping in most areas. So I sampled bee communities at 64 sites, which are clustered into groups of 4, but are at least 2 kilometers apart. So we kind of consider them to be independent of each other. My sites also span 4 ecoregions, which mainly divide the province from east to west. For my first study on bee communities, I caught bees using blue vane and colored bowl traps at all sites. So I put them directly on the ground along a roadside or ditch 5 meters apart, and I filled them with soapy water, and then I picked them up 5 hours later. For my second study on network stability, I caught wild bees while they were foraging on flowers by walking up and down a 50-meter transect for 10 minutes, which I repeated 3 times in different areas around the traps. I also excluded honeybees from these networks, which in hindsight might have not been the best idea. But anyway, so I only did these networks at half of the sites just due to time constraints. After I'd collected that data, I constructed summer-long plant bee networks for all my netted sites. And finally, I visited all sites 5 times from May through August over 2 years for both of my study, where May to August is the summer period. Finally, I gathered landscape data for my models. I measured landscapes in 7 buffers between 500 to 2,000 meter radii for their percent cover of cereal crops, such as corn and wheat, 4 crops like canola and soybean, as well as land cover diversity using SHDI, and amount of edge habitat using edge density. Okay, so what did I find? I actually ended up catching about 24,000 bees in total over 2 years, which was a lot, but it was good for my sample size. Anyway, so not surprisingly, I found that crop cover reduced bee abundance and richness. So the regression line and standard error bars within these plots are predicted values from my models, while the points represent observed values. Okay, if you notice, so beside my plots, I also have a distance within a circle, which represents the buffer size of the best model, which will come into play a little later on. So the negative effect was a little bit stronger for richness than it was for abundance. Where it had an effect, increasing for crop cover also had negative effects on bee abundance and richness, but ecoregion modified some of this effect. So for example, usually bees in Lake of the Woods responded differently compared to other ecoregions, but regional variation is not that surprising considering that things like vegetation, climate, even community composition of bees and other factors likely influence responses of the abundance and richness values. So in general, as crop cover increases, bee communities tend to become less abundant and less diverse, which kind of suggests that replacing natural vegetation with crops is bad for bees, at least at high levels. Okay, so for land cover diversity, I kind of found the opposite effect. I found that it enhanced bee abundance and richness in most ecoregions, whether the relationship was significant or whether it was just kind of trending towards that. So essentially, as land cover diversity increased, I generally saw a gain in the number of bees and the number of bee species, where the species is denoted by color in this diagram. So this would be obviously a good thing for both the natural community as well as farmers, since greater bee richness has been shown to enhance things like yields and other studies. Interestingly, the amount of edge habitat in the landscape had distinct effects from both the amount of cropped area or land cover diversity. So I found a positive effect on community functional dispersion, which could indicate that edge habitats, or more of them in the landscape, maintain a functionally diverse community of bees, even if species richness isn't increasing along the same gradient. This kind of looks like that as we have greater edge habitats accumulating in the landscape, we're having an enhanced number of functional traits within the community, where the functional traits are represented by color in this diagram. So yeah, we have a greater functional diversity of bees in areas of high edge habitat. Some studies have suggested that higher functional diversity can increase crop yields, so it's probably a good thing for farmers. Oops, sorry. Okay, so that was my bee community stuff. Now I'm going to move into very briefly about the plant bee network study. So essentially, I found that the extinction slopes of bees were positively affected by land cover diversity and negatively affected by forb crop cover. So if you remember, larger extinction slopes equals greater stability. So this would indicate that networks were more stable in areas of high diversity and low crop cover, which is what I expected. Okay, essentially it takes a greater number of plant extinctions to destabilize networks in areas of high land cover diversity or low forb crop cover compared to areas with low diversity or high cover, which I found destabilized networks more rapidly. So this would suggest that more diverse landscapes can support network stability. Okay, so finally, I wanted to mention scale of effect. In this study, networks responded at a scale about twice the size of bees. So in my bee community models, the best models were usually around 750 to 1,000 meters, whereas in the network models, they were upwards of 1,750 meters. Other people have found this too. So Burkle and Knight also found that networks work at a larger spatial scale compared to bee communities. It suggests that researchers should investigate landscapes beyond the typical 1,000 meters when studying networks. Okay, so the whole point of this was to formulate some management implications. So my study shows first that we need to manage agricultural areas at the landscape level in excess of about 1,000 meters to conserve local bee populations and to preserve network functionality. Secondly, it shows that what we should be managing for are diverse landscapes and landscapes with greater amounts of edge habitat. Luckily, there are already practices used in agriculture that could fit this model, such as intercropping, smaller field sizes, and a greater number of hedge rows or treed windbreaks. Of course, these suggestions would need further study within Manitoba to assess their ability to support wild bee populations and network stability in agricultural landscapes. All right, thank you for listening.